Good morning, everyone. My name is Zach Hurst. I'm with the Trust Company of Tennessee, and you'll see a couple other faces along with me. You'll see Andy Cunningham and Adam Davies, who I will introduce momentarily. Guys, perhaps we are just huge nerds, but I can't think of a better way to brighten up a rainy Thursday than to talk about fiduciaries for a little while. So I am excited about it. This is a very important topic. I think that we'll do our best to keep this conversational and certainly want to hear from the audience as well. So if you look in the screen, you'll see a section for questions. Please feel free to enter those at any time. We likely will address those at the end. We certainly will allocate time for the end. We might pick up one or two as we go, but please, as you think about questions as we talk, go ahead and input those there. Andy, I'm going to save the best for last with you and just introduce Adam and myself. Adam, I feel like we have done about 100 of these webinars together since the pandemic hit in March, and it's so nice to be able to bring in other experts like Andy to help us out and not make us talk the whole time. But my name again is Zach Hurst. I'm a certified financial planner in our Chattanooga market with the Trust Company of Tennessee, focusing primarily on retirement plan services. Adam Davies is a chartered financial analyst and a VP with our company. He heads up our retirement plan services, and we are a 338 fiduciary, which might mean something to you right now. If it still makes no sense to you at the end, I'm afraid we failed you miserably, so we will make sure that doesn't happen. Andy Cunningham is the regional managing director with Mass Mutual, working primarily with their funds and does a lot within that space. Separate of Mass Mutual and getting into his personal passion, he is also the founder of Fiduciary Awareness Day, which we'll also get into momentarily. Andy, I think you've got some colleagues from Mass with us on today. All good friends over there. We are so glad you guys are here, and especially grateful for you lending one of your finest to us for about an hour as we go through this. So a couple more just housekeeping notes that I'll get into, but what I'd like to do first is launch our first of 4 poll questions to kind of keep this fun and interactive. So if that could be brought up, there we go. And the question is, by the way, before I read this, if you are in full screen mode for this, then you won't be able to answer it. So you have to actually exit full screen mode. So if you have trouble, that's what it is. And we'll give you another minute to figure that out. But the question is, when I hear the word fiduciary, I, 1, get excited because I'm a HR 401k nerd at heart. 2, start getting nervous because liability is scary. 3, get confused because I'm not quite sure what it means, which again, I hope we can cure through this call today. Or 4, don't care, I am just here for the CE credit. So let's see who's being honest today. And while you put your answers in regarding CE credit, I believe what happens with this is we generate a report of those who attended for the full allotted time, and then we will send out the codes, automatically send out the codes to you for those. So we'll give you just a minute to answer this. And find some results. All right, nobody was here just for the CE credit, guys. Do we believe it?
Awesome.
I know. So start getting nervous because liability is scary. Yeah, it can be, you know, and it's not so long as you, the plan sponsors, and we, the providers, sort of have processes in place, right? And know who's playing what role and understand what each role is. And of course, we need to take care of the most important people within the 401k plans, which of course are the participants. So with that, Adam, I think we can jump into our presentation and kick off with the what is a fiduciary. A fiduciary is you, Adam, me, Andy, plan sponsors, pretty much all of us have some sort of fiduciary capacity, but by definition, it's a person who holds a legal or ethical relationship of trust with one or more parties. Okay, so for those of us in the 401k space or retirement plan space, it's all about the participants, right? They trust us to make all the right decisions for them. And we'll talk to you about who is the actual fiduciary on plans and how you maybe can hand off some of those responsibilities as a plan sponsor to your providers. But we're going to really hit on the various levels of the fiduciary providers as we go through this. Andy, we mentioned earlier that I think most of us go home after a long week, relax, don't think about work. You go home after a long week and start Fiduciary Awareness Day. So tell us about that and what that means and what it is.
Andy, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you all for the time today. And yeah, as Zach mentioned, Andy Cunningham, I work with Mass Mutual. I'm the regional managing director in the Southeast, and that's a fancy way of saying I sell investments within 401k plans. Is my day job. And then on the weekends, I like to do this little fiduciary awareness day thing. And really the idea started a few years ago, and the goal was to have an annual event on either March 16th or March 21st for the 316 fiduciary, the 321 fiduciary, and have a seminar where I got the best and brightest, not only from the retirement plan space, but also from the kind of thought leadership into a room where we could sit down and talk about innovative trends and concepts and different initiatives in the retirement plan space. But like most things, it's also evolved over the years. And one of the things is I have found that too many times us in this industry, we speak at such a level that is hard for the everyday participant to understand. And we have so many complexities within this industry that one of the things I wanted to do is really kind of bring the in-depth conversations, the tough concepts of the retirement plan space down to the level that the everyday participant can understand. And how we did that is through a series of whiteboard videos. We have about 17 whiteboards now where we're talking anything from what is a plan fiduciary to the new e-disclosure rules to investment basic series. But the whole concept is to be able to help plan advisors clearly and effectively communicate with participants, hopefully in an engaging and enlightening way. So that's the backdrop of the Fiduciary Awareness Day.
And Andy, quickly, you probably said this and I missed it. Where are those whiteboards? What's the website?
Fiduciaryawarenessday.com.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. And with that, I think we're ready for another poll question. So do you consider yourself a fiduciary to your retirement plan? So yes, no, maybe you're not sure just yet. Let's take a minute to see what everyone says. Maybe just a few more seconds. All right. So it looks like we had about 46% say yes, 41% no, and 12% not sure. So to those of you that answered yes, that's great that you know that you are in fact a fiduciary to your plan. And to those of you that answered no or I'm not sure, I think you might be interested in checking out this next chart that we have here. So there was a study done over the series of a few years where this same question was asked to a group of individuals. And the interesting thing about this is 100% of those folks were in fact fiduciaries to their plan. But you can see it was pretty consistent through 2013, 15, and 17. Just about 43% of those people did not think they were fiduciaries, even though they were in fact a fiduciary to their plan. So this might be a good opportunity to just pause and say, well, what exactly does make me a fiduciary to my plan, or am I not a fiduciary? And so really the functions that you perform are going to be what determines whether or not you're a fiduciary. So are you doing things like approving investment decisions? Are you selecting your service providers? Are you signing your 5500, your plan document? Any of those activities that really have any sort of action or impact on a plan will probably lean you more towards the fiduciary side. But if you're doing more administrative things, maybe working with payroll, things of that nature, then you may not be a fiduciary. So why does this matter? Well, there have been plenty of lawsuits filed against plan sponsors for allegedly not fulfilling their fiduciary responsibilities. And it really goes back to what Zach was talking about at the beginning, in that these retirement plans are for the ultimate benefits of participants. And with that come certain responsibilities, and there's even regulations to make sure that those responsibilities are upheld. So you can see here some of the lawsuits that were filed just over the last month. It can definitely seem very scary, but please don't let this scare you. If you're following a lot of the things we're going to be talking about in this webinar, the likelihood of this having a significant impact on your retirement plan is probably pretty small. And
Hey,
then
Adam,
once, yeah.
I'm sorry, the headlines are plenty here, and the font kind of small. Is there any theme here, right? Or is there one common theme between these, or is it really scattered?
Definitely. So two of the most common themes are lawsuits filed against plan sponsors for either excessive fees or inappropriate investment choices. Inappropriate investment choices was probably the greater theme, kind of in that 2008, 2009 timeframe. But more recently, the trend has focused towards excessive fees. So you can see a lot of those headlines here. But if this is a topic that interests you, actually our next webinar in October is going to focus solely on this topic. So what types of lawsuits are participants filing against plan sponsors? How can you mitigate your liability or your risk around these topics? So if that's of interest to you, please make sure to check that one out, and we'll have instructions at the end of this webinar to do so. So with that, Zach, we can turn it back to you.
Yeah, so this is a pretty interesting slide, and again, going back to the last poll question, the I don't know or the no answers, right? So as a plan sponsor, really what you need to understand is what can be delegated from a fiduciary standpoint. So think about it in two buckets. You have service providers and fiduciary providers, okay? And so you think about a third-party administrator with your compliance testing and your record keeper who's helping you with payroll and the majority of the work within a plan, plus an advisor who comes in and works with your participants to advise or educate or whatever it might be. It's important to understand whether they are a service provider or a fiduciary provider, right? And that can be figured out by certainly asking them whether they are or not, or looking at the documents, or whatever it might be. But you'll see that there are two on this pie chart. There are two sort of sections of this that cannot be delegated. Number one is you have to select and monitor whoever is working on your plan, right? So making sure that they are staying on top of what they need to stay on top of, doing a good job for your people. Number two, of course, census information, payroll, who's hired, who's fired. You've got to relay that information to them, right? That's the part that nobody can take over that responsibility for you. But the rest of it, right? The compliance testing, the advice, the custody, the investment and selection of managers, and the record keeping. If you have a fiduciary provider and not just a service provider, that alleviates a lot of the burden for you. So hopefully that makes sense. Adam, have I missed anything on this particular piece?
That sounds great.
Okay, good. And Andy, I think we're going to let you jump in here for a little while and take us through the different types of fiduciary providers and how people can maybe figure out who they're working with or what type of provider they are. So I'll let you go with that.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So before I dive into this slide, which I think is a great overview slide for us, I'm going to keep this at a high level, and then we're going to dive into the kind of finer complexities of each of these. But I want to explain what ERISA is so everybody understands the numbers here. ERISA is the governing body within the corporate retirement plan space. And as you see 316, 321, 338, that is actually the section of the ERISA code where these rules or regulations are made up of. So when we look at a 316 administrator, if you take one thing away about that today, what I want you to understand is the 316 administrator is going to help you with the administration of the day-to-day roles of the plan. The 321 is an investment advisor. They're going to help you invest with the from a recommendation perspective. And then when you look at the 338, think of the 338 investment manager is that they're going to make the investment decisions for you. So as we look at the next slide and we dive a little bit deeper into this.
And Andy, you mentioned ERISA. Some of us may have heard that term, some of us may not. Can you briefly explain what ERISA is?
Yeah, ERISA is the governing body. It's all the rules and regulations in the corporate retirement plan space can be found under the ERISA code. It was founded back in 1974, I think is the year. So all the regulations that we'll talk about today are from that ERISA code.
Thank you.
So as we look at the 316 plan administrator, any company who is going to offer a retirement plan, they're going to act as the plan administrator. And basically what that means is they're going to have to manage the day-to-day operations of the plan. That being said, under ERISA 316, you can also offset the duty of the day-to-day operations to a 316 manager. And really what that's going to allow you to do is give it to a third party that is going to basically have delegate the duty and kind of the discretionary control of the operations of that. And what some of those operations are, you look at it, they're going to make sure that the signing and the filing of the 5500 is taken care of, that the maintaining of the necessary plan documents, the I's are dotted, the T's are crossed. They're going to handle any of the participant notifications, but also take care of any of the vesting eligibility and kind of the plan policy information as well. Anything you wanted to add there?
Well, so Andy, I know a lot of plans that I talk to, they might work with a service provider called a third-party administrator, TPA. Is that the same thing as a 316?
You know, they could definitely be skewed, kind of is the same. There's some gray area, but they actually are not. When you hire when you hire a third-party administrator, you are still going to have to make the discretionary decisions but they're going to help you with the day-to-day aspect. When you hire a 316 fiduciary, they are going to take over all of that. So the plan sponsor is basically delegating the duty and the discretionary control over to that fiduciary.
Awesome, thank you.
Andy, I don't hear, you're going to get into the next two levels of fiduciary providers. I don't hear as much about 316s. I mean, is it pretty common or?
It's fairly common, but it's definitely not as common as the investment manager fiduciaries. And I think I think as you see the lawsuits and where kind of the lawsuits have come from, it's been on that investment side. And I think that's why the 321s and the 338s tend to be a little bit more common.
Got it. Thank you.
So as we look at the 321, before I dive into that, I want to take a quick step back and talk about an investment policy statement and kind of what the investment policy statement is, because I'm going to use that as an example, and I want to make sure everybody kind of follows that example. But the investment policy statement is the governing document of the plan. The way the plan is run and administered needs to be in line with the document of the investment policy statement, the rules and regulations kind of set forth by the plan committee or a co-fiduciary. So as we look at the 321 investment advisor fiduciary, basically this fiduciary is going to help make recommendations to the plan committee, but they do not have any discretionary control over the selection of the investment decision. So let me kind of explain that a little bit further. Think of this as, let's say we have a large cap growth fund that you're looking to replace or hire. This 321 fiduciary is going to look at the whole universe of funds. Let's say for conversation purposes, there's 500 funds eligible in this large cap growth space. They are going to use their expertise as a 321 fiduciary, as well as the criteria set forth in the investment policy statement to kind of narrow that universe down to, let's say 3 to 5 investment selections that they will then pass off to the plan sponsor or the plan officials to help make that decision. That is the main responsibility of the 321 investment advisor, is to make the recommendation to the committee, where then the committee will make the final decision. So a couple others that responsibilities, they're going to help monitor the performance. If the performance does not meet the criteria of the investment policy statement, they're going to suggest replacement options when that is appropriate. And honestly, the 321 can also help build that investment policy statement for the plan committee as well. Anything there you'd like to add, Adam?
No, I think that was a great summary. So definitely great to have that extra set of eyes looking at the investments. I mean, 500 is a lot of funds to research. So, having someone to give you some of that analysis and those recommendations can definitely be a great way to cover yourself as a plan fiduciary.
I would agree with that. So as we take a look at the 338 manager, the main difference between this manager is that they have full investment discretion over what fund choices will go into the menu. So if we were to take a look at the example we used a little while ago, the 338 manager is going to take a look at all the investments in that large cap growth. Again, we're using 500 as the example, but instead of passing off 3 to 5 recommendations, they are going to select the investment that is most appropriate for that plan based off of their expertise, but also the criteria set forth in the investment policy statement. Now, I say that, but it is extremely important to understand, just because you hire a 338 manager, that doesn't mean you get to sit back, watch them do the work, and there's nothing that you need to do. It is explicitly mentioned by the DOL and in ERISA that the plan sponsor has a duty to monitor the investment selection process, but also their 338 manager. So basically, they need to make sure that the manager is documenting the way they're supposed to, that the decisions that are being made are in line with the investment policy statement. So although you do have a little bit more fiduciary protection, you can't just sit back and let all the decisions and everything be made from that perspective. You still have that duty to monitor. I do think the one criteria that is required is that you have to acknowledge in writing that this person will be the 338 manager.
Definitely, and so that's why it really is so important that, you know, when your provider reaches out and says, hey, let's do a meeting, let's review the plan, that's really that opportunity for you to evaluate the provider's process and say, okay, are they doing their job? Are they replacing the funds that need to be replaced? And so I know we like to reach out to our clients and schedule these meetings, and there's probably things with your day-to-day responsibilities that you want to focus on, but, you know, we definitely appreciate the opportunity to get together with our clients, you know, since we do serve in this 338 capacity, to make sure that we are informing you of everything you need to be able to properly fulfill your responsibilities.
And Andy, when you say acknowledge in writing, I know that we serve as trustee on 401k plans for our providers as a 338. Is that what you mean, serving as trustee on the plan, or could it vary?
Yes.
Okay.
Great. Why don't we go to the next slide? And I think we have a poll question. This will be our last poll question before we exit. What level of support is your investment advisor currently offering? So again, this is focusing on the investment side. Sometimes we see folks getting support from a broker or an advisor. They're not necessarily serving in that fiduciary capacity. Sometimes we see the 321 that Andy mentioned, the 338, and then a lot of folks aren't sure. So let's take a moment and go through and answer which of these applies to your plan. Maybe just a few more seconds. All right, we have our results. So this is great. You can see the majority of folks are working with a 338 on this call. I hope a lot of those are current trust company clients. Some are receiving some investment support, but not necessarily fiduciary. Some are working with that 321. That's great that you know what level of service your provider is giving. And then there's a couple folks that aren't sure. So with that, I'm going to write these down because that'll come in handy when we talk about the next slide. But you can go ahead, Zach.
I'm sorry, but before that, Adam, I had a question I'd kind of like to address right now, if that's okay.
Sure.
With you and Andy, and the question came in. It's a really good question from the audience, and it's do we see, in terms of being a fiduciary and hiring fiduciary providers versus service providers, do we see any themes between smaller versus larger plans, right? I know they're available to everybody, but Adam, maybe I'll start with you and then lead into Andy of, if you're a smaller plan, is it any less important or more important versus a larger plan?
That's a great question. And so, whether you're a small or a large plan, you still have the same liability, the same risk in terms of overseeing the investments. But sometimes with some of those smaller companies, we do see them prefer, the 338 model simply because they're focused on their core business, making sure their employees are excelling at their jobs, they're helping their customers as best they can, and they want to offer a competitive retirement plan, but maybe don't necessarily want to be involved in the day-to-day of picking those funds or making those investment decisions. Sometimes once you get into some of the larger organizations, you might have more folks to serve on that committee. Maybe someone who has even some experience in this arena or personally interested in investments. And so sometimes those folks like to have a little bit more control or say in the process. And so a 321 might make sense in that aspect if you have those people that are really engaged and really want to be part of the process and don't want to delegate it to a service provider. Zach or Andy, I'm not sure if there's anything you'd add.
I think that was perfect. Yeah, I think it greatly sums it up. I think you typically in the larger market, you'll see more of a sophisticated committee. So they will be more willing to make some of those investment decisions. And then in the smaller market, it tends to see a little bit more on the 338 side of things.
Awesome. That was a great question. So looking back at our poll, some of you do know who you're working with, 321 or 338. Many of you weren't sure. And we wanted to ask that question because there was actually a survey sent out last year to a lot of plan sponsors, several hundred, asking the very same question. So, do you have a service provider helping you on the investment side? And if so, are they serving as a fiduciary? And you can see some of the different service models here in this chart. Starting with the left, you have some of the gray boxes, and these would fall into the category of providing investment support, but maybe not necessarily in that fiduciary capacity. And as you move from left to right, you're definitely increasing the amount of fiduciary support, protection, and things that you're offloading to your service providers. And so you can see about 40% of plans do utilize that 321 service provider. A little bit fewer, 19% utilize a 338 service provider. I think this has really started to gain a little bit of traction over the last 10 years or so as things have gotten more complicated. People have really wanted to delegate that investment decision-making process to a full 338 fiduciary. But then you can see a lot of folks just weren't sure. And so about 31% weren't necessarily confident in knowing if they were working with a 321, a 338, or even getting any fiduciary support. So Andy, this might be a good segue into talking about, well, how do you know if you're working with that fiduciary provider or a 321 versus 338?
Right. Yeah. So as we mentioned earlier, really the main difference is in who is going to have discretionary authority to make the decisions on of the investment, underlying investments. So on a 321, you're typically going to have a more hands-on approach. You're going to be responsible for more of the documentation. You're going to be responsible for, as you do hire the 321, you're going to have to make that investment decision, although they're going to narrow it down for you, where the 338 is going to actually perform those duties for you. So 321, a little bit less protection, more responsibilities. 338, a little bit more fiduciary protection, but you do still have the responsibility and the duty to monitor your 338 to make sure they're doing what they say they're doing.
So from a practical standpoint, I know I talk with a lot of plans and, they might not be sure whether they're working with a 321 or 338. And so what I've commonly found is a good way to differentiate between the two is, if you do your committee meetings, you review the funds. If your investment advisor currently has like a watch list or like a green light, yellow light, red light rating system for the funds, that might be a good way to know that you might be working with a 321 service provider, because like we said, that 338 is really going to be taking on the discretion and making those changes proactively on your behalf, while notifying you along the way of any changes made.
So guys, on the 321, I think that maybe is the one that gets confused the most, right? Because you have a broker coming in and providing recommendations or maybe education or perhaps it's advice. So I guess, how do you know if they're a 321 or not? And if it's education or advice, I mean, does that matter?
That's a great question, and I'd say probably the best way to know for sure whether you're working, with a fiduciary, whether that's 321 or 338, is to check your service agreement. I know sometimes there can be a lot of legalese and investment jargon in those service agreements, so it might not be a bad idea just to call up your service provider and say, hey, I've seen a lot of articles or sat in on webinars, and I'm just curious, what level of fiduciary support are you providing? Are you a 321? Are you a 338? And that could be a good opportunity to open up that conversation.
Got it. And Adam, one more thing I want to get, this is for both of you too. I want to go back to, not actually go back to, but think back to the slide with the lawsuit for the last month. And so as a plan sponsor, when you think about a participant bringing a lawsuit to you or however it evolves and ultimately there's a lawsuit involved, what is the role? Let's assume this person has a 321 or a 338, right? So what's the role and responsibility of the plan sponsor at that time? What do they know they can sort of pass off as it relates to that versus they have to handle themselves?
Sure. Well, I think probably the most important thing, and Andy had mentioned this before, is documentation. So if you're working with that 321 service provider, you are ultimately making the decisions of the plan. You're getting that advice and support from your 321 advisor. They're telling you, hey, in our search of large cap growth with 500 funds, we think these 3 to 5 are the best. So make sure you have that documented, one in the investment policy statement, and then 2 in the meeting minutes to show, okay, we have a very consistent process. That process, if followed, should lead to very good investment results. One of the nice things is that the DOL does realize that not everyone has a crystal ball. So they're not necessarily going to be looking at, did you pick the number one fund over the last 10 years, or did your fund fall in the bottom quartile? Really, they're just going to be looking at, did you analyze all the information? Did you follow a consistent process that should more times than not lead to good investment decisions? So that's if you're working with the 321. But if you're working with a 338, the responsibility is a little bit more on them because they're really pulling the trigger. They're still going to be doing the same research that a 321 is doing, but they're more likely to document this on your behalf in the meeting minutes because it is ultimately, their responsibility to pick that investment fund. And so you're going to see the 338 picking up a lot of that work because ultimately, there is a greater responsibility with them. Now, as Andy was saying, that doesn't totally alleviate all of your responsibility. You still want to make sure you meet with your provider, your 338, periodically to make sure that they are doing that process that you hired them to do. And so doing your quarterly, semi-annual, or annual meetings is a really great way to make sure that process is being followed. Andy, anything I'd left out or that you'd add?
No, I think that was great. Yeah, I think that was great. It's all about the documentation. At the end of the day, the Department of Labor, they don't necessarily care what the answer is, but they want to know how you got to that answer and the processes and the decisions that were made.
And guys, one other question here. My experience to this is with our company, right? To where we play all roles, the record keeper, the administrator, and the advisor on plans. Is that the case for all 338 providers? I mean, are they going to own every aspect of the plan, or could it be that you have multiple providers but still a 338?
Definitely, it would be the latter. So you have some folks that really do take that full bundled approach where they're doing all aspects of the retirement plan. Here at the trust company, like you said, we do serve as a 338 on the investment side. We do also do the record keeping as well as the administration. But you have a lot of firms that really want to specialize just on the investment side. And so they may serve as just a 338. They may serve as just a 321. Sometimes we even see firms will do both. For clients that really want that 321, they'll serve in that capacity, or for others, they might serve as a 338. So that's why it's really so important to check your service agreement and make sure you're having these conversations with your service provider to know exactly what sort of support you are getting from them.
Great. I know we have a few more. Can I make one or two more interruptions with questions that are coming in because they're pretty pertinent to this, and I think they're really good. This is a really good one. from the audience, and the question is, I'm assuming we are on a 338 because I get notified on different investment decisions Fidelity is making through ADP. Is that correct?
From the way that question was phrased, it does appear to me that you would be working with a 338 because you're not actually being asked to approve Fund A or Fund B. The fund change, it sounds like, is already occurring and you're just being notified. So that would indicate to me that you're probably working with a 338.
Agreed.
Yeah, probably still worth asking the question or checking the documents to be sure, but yeah, it does sound that way. And one more before we move on, I like this one as well. It says, do all service providers have the capability to offer fiduciary services as we think about 316, 321, and 338?
Sure. And so I'll just speak from experience, but I think this is something that has really evolved over the last 10 or 20 years. So if you go back in time, pre-2000, there were a lot more wealth managers that were, also dabbling in retirement plans. If you think about it, the concept is pretty similar, advising on an individual's wealth, advising on a retirement plan. You're still selecting funds at the end of the day. So that service model was pretty common. But just over the last 10, 15, 20 years, we've seen a lot more regulations passed specifically affecting retirement plans. You could think back to March of this year when the CARES Act was passed, or last December when the Secure Act was passed. All of these new legislation items dramatically affected retirement plans and how they operate. And so we've definitely seen a little bit more of a shift into people specializing into retirement plans. And I think that's where that fiduciary or non-fiduciary aspect comes into play, and that those that are focusing solely on retirement plans are more likely to take up that fiduciary support, whereas some of those people who maybe did a lot more wealth management but had a few retirement plans, they might be less likely to serve in that fiduciary capacity.
Right. All right. I will shut my mouth and let us move on from here.
Great. Well, these are great questions, so thank you everyone for asking them. Just a few more slides here. So, Andy, how might you decide if you want to work with a 321?
Yeah, I think there's really three kind of main questions a committee should ask themselves when deciding between a 321 and a 338. The first is, how hands-on do they want to be from a day-to-day perspective with the decision-making process? What level of protection do they want from a fiduciary coverage standpoint? And then finally, taking a look at the committee, the plan committee, do they feel that they have the necessary expertise on that committee to effectively perform due diligence of investments? So once you can answer those three questions, I think it'll lead you down to a path of where you would want to go from that perspective. So for example, you might want a 321 fiduciary if you want to be more hands-on. You do feel that the investment committee has a sophistication and kind of a knowledge to be able to perform that due diligence. And then finally, you're not totally over worried about all the protection, all the fiduciary coverage that you need, because of you have the time to do the day-to-day operations. You have no problem with the documentation of the decisions that are being made, and again, the effectiveness of the due diligence. Conversely, if you look at a 338, I think maybe it's a committee that is too busy to deal with the day-to-day operations, that they want to offload some of that responsibility. They would like that extra level of protection, but then finally, that they just feel that maybe it's a committee that needs to focus more of their time on running the business and the decisions that are being made, whether that's the hiring and firing, the payroll, so on and so forth, and they don't have maybe a person or two that they feel could help perform the due diligence from an investment perspective.
Andy, you mentioned the word committee a lot. We had a webinar, I think, Adam, it was last month, where we had a former investigator from the DOL come in and really hammered home the importance of establishing that committee, right? And so I think a lot of organizations, it's a hassle. It's a hassle to put this together and try to find people to do it, meet quarterly or whatever it is. But is that something you see in your world too, of as you say that, think about a 321 especially, right, where you're having to make decisions. Is that something where you're seeing a lot of people really pushing towards a committee right now?
Absolutely. Absolutely. More and more plans that I'm dealing with through financial advisors, if they don't have committees, they're taking the steps to effectively form a committee to help make those decisions. And I understand, like, the retirement plan, when the folks on the committee come in for their day-to-day job, retirement plan is probably ninth or 10th down on their list of things they need to perform and need to take care of that day. But the reality is the liability is higher than most of the other roles and responsibilities. So it is extremely important that if you don't have a committee, it would be very wise to form a committee that you can help make all these day-to-day decisions so you don't get into a litigious environment.
Thank you. All right. I think I am back up here to check the audience questions that have come in. There is one I saw. I don't know. This is my fault. I don't know if it's answered in text on here, if everybody can see it or not. So let me just address this regardless. The question is this also eligible for SHRM credit or only CE credit? It is available for SHRM credit. We will send that out to you following this. So my fault on the language there. One question that came in early on, and I should have addressed it earlier, it says, how do I know if my provider is a fiduciary? So again, that's something correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but we can check plan documents on that, check service agreements, and even after that, it's probably still worth asking the question to your TPA, to your record keeper and or advisor, whether or not they serve in that capacity. And by the way, I want to point this out. It's okay if they don't, right? This isn't a right or wrong model. It's just understanding where you have fiduciary protection versus just service providers. So, it's not a lesson of, go ask, and if they say no, well, then they're fired. That's not what we're saying at all. It's more putting you in a position as a plan sponsor of understanding where you really have the liability versus your providers. Okay. The next question is hiring a fiduciary expensive? Let's see. Who wants to take that one?
I don't mind.
But the one comment I would make in regard to that, and Adam will address the cost of it per se, but what we are seeing, at least in my environment, is that the cost between a 321 and a 338 has started to become more in line. So I know 10 years ago, it may have been twice as much to hire a 338 fiduciary, but as we've evolved in this industry and we have started to see that spread narrow very much. And in some cases, it's the same.
Sure. And I'd agree with that. I guess my short answer to that question would be not necessarily. There's certainly some times where, it might be more expensive than what you're paying today. That just depends on, what your current arrangement is and, what you're being charged for that. But, we do fee comparisons for clients all the times. And I definitely see those sometimes come back where, even us serving as a 338, we sometimes will be less expensive. That's certainly not always the case. And by no means are we always going to be the lowest cost provider. But I think it is worth, doing that exercise of getting that fee comparison. The Department of Labor recommends that you do that periodically. Most people interpret that to be, every 3 to 5 years, get a fee comparison, do fee benchmarking to figure out, exactly where your fees stand. And you might be surprised. It might come back less expensive. It might come back comparable. It could come back a little bit more expensive. So it really just depends on kind of where you are right now and, what types of providers you're considering working with. If that is something that's ever of interest to anyone, you can reach out to Zach or I after this presentation, and we can kind of give you an apples to apples comparison of what you're paying today, what it might look like to work with a fiduciary, and what should be typical based upon your plan size or your number of participants.
Great, thank you, Adam. One other question, Adam, I think I'm going to send this your way. It is, why aren't all providers fiduciaries?
That's a good question. So I think we briefly covered this a little bit earlier, and I think it does kind of go back to that evolving service model where, 20 plus years ago, a lot more wealth managers tended to dabble in retirement plans. wasn't necessarily their core day-to-day focus. But as things have gotten a little bit more complex, as more legislation has passed, that you really need to stay on top of if you're going to be a retirement plan advisor. Those that have decided to commit to that business have really tended to adopt the fiduciary model, where some of those where it's not a core focus haven't really adopted that fiduciary model.
Got it. And probably a quick one here. This just came in as well. It says, just to clarify, we are discussing coverage at the plan level, correct?
Yes. So the three different types of fiduciaries, the 316, the 321, the 338, those are all fiduciaries at the plan level. Andy, do you want to maybe briefly cover the fiduciary aspect covering participants?
Yeah, there's a often not discussed fiduciary called the 408 G fiduciary. And basically what that one allows you to do is, if there are managed accounts, you can have an outside advisor help make investment decisions at the participant level on that one.
Got it. That helps. Thank you, Andy. And guys, I think that wraps up questions from the audience. If you don't mind, I will begin to close us out here, and thank you again to everybody who attended today. Andy, you were wonderful. Thank you. And again, to our friends at MassMutual who joined today, you have one of the very best, and thanks for joining us for this. So we do have another of the another webinar coming up on October 29th. Adam, am I right on that?
Yes,
Yeah.
and so that was the one I had talked about a little bit earlier on, where if you were really interested in what are some of the litigation areas focusing on, that's going to be the topic of our next webinar. And so we're going to be exploring that in a little bit more detail.
Great. Excellent. And again, that is not to, one of our ERISA attorneys who's joining us for that call said, I think he described it as, this is not a scare tactic, it is a make aware tactic. So it's not all doom and gloom, it's just making sure processes are in place and we are taking care of ourselves. So right after this call, we're gonna have an exit survey with I think 2 or 3 questions. If you don't mind, please just take a moment to answer those. And I believe, guys, we have covered what we need to cover. Adam, have I missed anything?
That's it. I'd say just to those who answered they were unsure at the beginning of the webinar, we hope you have a better understanding of what a 321 is, what a 338 is, how to know if you're working with one or the other. And so thank you for joining, everyone.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Y'all have a great day.